Yes, friends. On a Monday morning, as I get the frogs out of my throat, it is OGP coming to you live on YouTube, as always, breaking down the NFL draft that was. Along with myself, Adam Armbrecht, joined as always by the healthy, the wealthy, and the wise, Mr. Andrew Makowitz. How are we, sir?
Adam, it must feel like it's like January 3rd for you, where you get through the holiday season and you have your Hanukkah, your Christmas, your New Year's, you're partying, you don't have any work to do, and then all of a sudden, like January 3rd hits, you're like, I have resolutions that I need to get back to work, I need to stop all the libations I've been drinking. Is that how you feel now that the NFL draft is over?
Well, I'll let you in on a little secret here, friends. Between us, don't share this with anybody. But so Thursday night, big draft night, obviously the big first round pick, and then Friday, and second and the third round. Then it gets into the weekend. So Courtney and I went up to the cabin that we've mentioned a couple of times before on the podcast. So we go up there and we have just a restful. We just did a day trip. Came back the following day on Saturday, and while we're driving home, friends, I say these words. I go, man, like imagine leaving something important at the cabin that you had to go back for, because it's about a 3-hour drive, 3.5-hour drive from where we live. And she was like, oh my God, that'd just be so brutal. So we drive back and we meet up with my dad. We have a nice dinner. We get home 11:30, 11:45 at night, open up the back seat of the car, pulling out bags. And I go, hey, my laptop's not here. And she's like, you're hilarious. What a jokester you are. And I go, no, it's not here. She's like, maybe it's at my dad's. Next morning, wake up 8:45, go to my dad's house. It's not there, and it's back to the cabin, friends. I drove over a 36-hour period. I drove something like 18 hours, including a day trip that was a 7.5 straight shot, walked into the cabin, picked up my laptop from the couch, right back into the car, and right back down the highway.
Yeah, and that's got to be a tough one. Like, once you grab the laptop, you're like, oh, thank goodness. But then you got to like literally turn around and get back in the car. What did you do to keep yourself occupied for, the 6.5, 7-hour round trip during your
excursion? I enjoy music, so the Strokes were a big part of my journey. Modest Mouse was a big part of my journey. Talking to myself was a big part of my journey. And then also because, yes, where the cabin is, the radio does fade. There is not going to be ESPN radio out where I'm going. So I thought a lot about the Giants NFL draft and how I would look back on it when we came right here this morning.
It was almost like you subconsciously left it there so that you could have 3.5 hours each way to get your mind right on what you think Dave Gettleman did right and wrong in this year's draft.
Just had to digest it all. I just needed the time alone. And by the way, so let's start there, obviously. We're going to get into all the picks, that specifically the players that were drafted by the New York Football Giants. There's some things that did come to mind over the course of the draft that maybe was a dose of reality or reminder about how we should think about the draft, specifically around our team and years past. But what was your overall takeaway? We know trade downs, multiple trade downs for the Giants in the first and second rounds. They trade up in the third round for a target that they want. Did you feel like the Giants really came into and out of this draft with a plan in mind, a structure of how they wanted to approach things, and then check the boxes that they wanted to?
Well, so I think this is the best draft that the Giants have had in over a decade. I think going into it, there was a lot of concern about, was Dave Gettleman going to get value? Were they going to reach for an edge rusher because it was an area of need at 11? What was going to be the pick? Where were they going to take certain players? And guess what? All that you read is the planning that Joe Judge and Dave Gettleman did in terms of scenarios and players that they wanted. It felt like the Giants weren't rigid in this draft. Overall, I give them an A- is my grade for them. I want to give them an A+, but there's kind of two things that are holding me back here, Adam. And I'm sure you're probably thinking the same thing as me. One was surprised that we reached as far as we did in round 1 to get Kadarius Toney, but we can get into some of the affirmations afterwards that we've heard about that pick. And number 2 is we actually didn't draft an offensive lineman during this draft, which absolutely floored me. If you had given me a wager on one of my betting sites, if the Giants are going to take an offensive lineman in this draft, I would have lost a significant amount of money.
Well, yeah. Listen, I think and so that's funny because we'll get into it in a second here. But overall, I thought it was great, right? When you talk about the moves that they made, obviously you get draft assets for next year's draft class. Where what the reports are is that it's a very deep draft, and that many GMs were coveting the idea of being able to pick up picks next year and kind of safeguard against an uncertain draft class this season, or maybe guys that have some small injury concerns, and not even off the field, but just saying, where's the tape, right? Some guys opted out, some guys got partial seasons, and even guys that came back and played mostly full years. It's hard to gauge what competition they're playing against and what the true value of some of these guys are. So I think that there's validity in having both the general positivity, because I think every regard about it was that the Giants fleeced the Chicago Bears. Like, it felt like they got a haul to move down to 20. To your point about taking the wide receiver there, that at the time in the moment, I maybe thought about Kwity Paye, or maybe one of the offensive linemen or things like that. But it's hard for me to then hang my hat on that when on the back end of it, and this isn't just because we didn't take him, but guys like Kwity Paye, even he seemed to fall into this category with Owe and with some of the other edge rushers where they good players, but they're not finished products yet. They're still going to have to work, right? They're still going to have to refine their game a little bit. So I think that maybe is the difference between seeing value at a position of need like edge rusher, like offensive lineman, versus saying this wide receiver talent is incredibly highly regarded. We had one, I don't know if it was Mel Kiper or another scout that said he had him. I was listening the other day to a couple of coverage around it, had him as the third best wide receiver behind Chase and I think Smith maybe. So he may even put him ahead of Waddle or ahead of Smith, one of the two there. So even if he was the fourth best, but was very close to those top three guys, I think that also buoys the value of taking him there at that selection while still getting really good value at that point as well.
Yeah, I mean, overall, look, I'm starting to warm up to Kadarius Toney as a pick. I didn't mind taking a wide receiver there. You and I both probably had Rashad Bateman as a little bit more polished and someone that if we're going to move up a little bit to get, we would have been excited about it. But, when we talk about, that pick in particular, it kind of set the stage for how we were going to draft from there on out. But like we talked about, I was shocked that plan ended up not having an offensive lineman in there. And if you hear some of the quotes about it, you start to understand kind of where the Giants went. It wasn't that they were against taking a lineman. They just did not see the value at the picks that they were presented.
No, exactly. Right. So, I mean, you're talking about, again, the value. So at 11, you're sitting there and saying, even if you liked, they ended up not taking Kwity Paye when they had the chance to, but even if you like them, at 11, where is the value there? And then when you get a team like Chicago who wants to come up to target a player, you feel like we now have a chance to, again, stockpile picks going forward and still give ourselves a great opportunity to get a quality player. But I will say, before we get into specifically the picks that they made throughout this draft, there was something, as I'm referring to, the philosophical reminder. So when we came into it, there's a couple of things that we talked about leading up to the draft. One was offensive line. In general, the NFL consensus is if you have three guys if you have 3/5 of your line that you feel you're locked into, you're in a good place. Solid guys. Then you want to supplement them with two respectable, right? Serviceable, sometimes veterans or sometimes developmental players. So I took a step back. Go back to last year. The New York Football Giants spent a first, a third, and a fifth round pick on the offensive line. And they also moved Nick Gates into center. Now, so you can say, Lemieux, fifth rounder. Okay. There's some questions there, but at the very least, if you're the Giants, you're Dave Gettleman, Joe Judge, you go, we did it. We did it. We spent 3 of our draft picks last year on our offensive line and put Gates in a new position that we like him at. And by the end of the year, we really liked what we were seeing across the board from all these players, even from Andrew Thomas, who struggled early. Matt Pert flashed it. Shane Lemieux, we know pass protection, going to have to work on that, but he was a beast in the run game. And the footnote to it to me was Wayne Gallman. Remember we were saying, God, Wayne Gallman's finally putting it together. Maybe it was just the offensive line was putting it together and Wayne Gallman was reaping that benefit. So I cast my mind back there and thought, okay, So the Giants are a little bit more bullish on the offensive line than we maybe thought. And then you combine it with where they're picking and if the value is correct. But I think that the Giants look at it and say, we feel really good there. Edge rusher is a little bit different because you see that they take multiple picks basically from the second to fourth round. So the mid rounds there, and they wanted to rebuild that. They wanted to make that better. Little surprised about, cornerback and going to those waters. But likewise, cast your mind back and think about the hits and misses they've had in the draft at that position. And you feel like, even though this is kind of the one where you go the other way with it. We were excited about Darnay Holmes, but, little flashes, but there's still some question marks there. So bringing in more value at that position seemed to make sense as well. So I realized that you really got to go back and not look at it from the outside or what maybe we think they need or want. And I'm sure you're going to see them next year go after an offensive lineman. But you have to apply what happened the year prior, I think, a little bit heavier to how they approach the draft, because no organization is going to say, we spent all these picks, 80% of them are trash. Year number 2, you're not going to have that sense of that draft class.
Yeah, I mean, Dave Gettleman even said it himself. He said, apparently we like the guys in our building more than other people do. And he was referring to his offensive linemen. And he said, we've spent draft capital and we're letting these young guys build. And, the problem is, as a fan, we saw the offensive line. We saw at times it was an absolute mess. This is such a critical year to figure out what you have with Daniel Jones that I don't want it to be that Shane Lemieux or Zach Fulton or Nick Gates looks like a turnstile and Daniel Jones is spending half the time on his back, and we don't know whether or not we have a franchise quarterback. And so for me, that's the biggest challenge. If he's saying that the offensive line is middle of the road in the league, which is what we need it to be in order to get a proper evaluation of Daniel Jones, then I'm fine. But if the offensive line doesn't perform, even with this draft being as great as it was, I'm looking squarely at Gettleman again and saying, we all think that it needs help. You're saying that you don't. You're there every day. If it's not working midway through the season, how can we from 10,000 feet away see this and you can't admit a mistake or understand that it's an area that you need to address?
Yes, no, 100%, and that's why I think we hope, right? We hope that it does all work out the way that Gettleman, and then I'll say I lean in on Joe Judge, right, and say I hope that you have this figured right, because then it means we are on a very strong path forward. And by the way, and this isn't a good thing, but stockpiling those picks the way they did does mean that if something doesn't work out at a key position, you have multiples in the first, in the third, in the fifth, I think, or the fourth round next year to be able to move around the board and address those areas of need. We're going to now move into, of course, covering the picks that were made here throughout the draft. A quick footnote that I'll say just to get it out of the way is post-draft. As we know, the Giants like to get in there on the undrafted free agents. They did sign Brett Hedgie out of the center out of Florida. They did sign Jake Burton, the offensive lineman out of Baylor, and they also signed Raymond Johnson III, defensive end out of Georgia Southern. So just to supplement what they've done in this draft class, they did go out and get a couple of offensive linemen that they probably feel pretty good about and try to develop this year. And you can look at a position of need like right guard, maybe where it could be veteran in Fulton, or just in the background here, we did forget, I will acknowledge, and there is a correlation here to the NBA. We obviously cover that, for the Nets. Jason Tatum had COVID-19 early in the season, and he's talked about how it really, really dragged him down. He hasn't been able to have the same energy, and he's finally gotten back to that place here later in the season. Will Hernandez also had COVID last year. So there is some sense here that I at least want to, and we've said, right, if it's not working out, this will be the last year for him, but I'm going to at least give that opportunity for him to come into the season, into training camp, and maybe show that he does still have something. And now you'll have him there with Fulton. I think that's probably the safeguard they had by bringing in Fulton, but maybe Will Hernandez can still be a starter on this line, and that would change our outlook too.
Adam, I don't know if you have the data, but did Will Hernandez contract COVID in like 2018, and he's had it for 3 years? Like how long did the residual effects last for Will Hernandez?
Well, he had pre-symptoms is what it was.
Pre-symptoms for 2.5 years. Then okay, got it. Yeah, perfect. That explains his porous play for his entire Giants career. But I don't want to get too far off topic with Will Hernandez, because I like going down a spiral with that. I want to talk about a man an artist named Young Joka. What do you have for me, Adam?
This kid's a voice, friends. This kid, listen, we're talking about Kadarius Toney and his burgeoning rap career, which he is a fan of. He does it. You can find him on YouTube. I think it's quite good. It's very enjoyable. The sound is lovely. And inevitably, so on this podcast, just to shout out Tony, if you want to come on and talk about exclusively your music, if you'd like to, we'd love to hear about it, because we don't look at NFL players or athletes as guys that can only be doing one specific thing without expanding their vision possibly anywhere beyond the field or the court, etc. But of course, naturally, that comes up after Kadarius Toney is drafted, and they say, boy, does this guy have the focus, right? Is he really about football? The same way they do this all the time with Damian Lillard. Am I right?
Adam, this is my favorite part of this conversation, is when they're like, his sole focus isn't on football. They did this with Trevor Lawrence at one point just because he was amazing. But with Kadarius Toney specifically, they're saying his emerging rap career is really going to impact his focus on the NFL. He really needs to make football his number one priority. It's a lot of undertones and insinuations and innuendos when Aaron Rodgers is hosting Jeopardy, answering, like asking questions. And they said he prepped day and night for it. Then after he's done with that, he destroys his front office and basically says, I'm never playing for you again. And then he flies with all his buddies to the Kentucky Derby and looks like a guy from True Detective out there looking for his perpetrator somewhere in the stands. It's like what are we talking about here? Aaron Rodgers can do whatever he wants, but Kadarius Toney can't have 200 views and make a couple of YouTube videos. Like, this is so nonsensical.
Listen, it's hypocritical comes to mind. There's other things that come to mind when we talk about if you're a prominent white athlete versus being a black athlete. Apparently, it just feels a little bit different when you have other things that you like to do, as opposed to the proverbial shut up and dribble, right? That moniker seems to attach itself very heavily to a specific demographic within sports, because rap, I couldn't possibly, but Jeopardy, that's the thinking man's activity. Like, that must be totally okay. And by the way, too, the overarching of all this stuff is always about talent. It's always about results, right? If you're really good at what you're doing, Damian Lillard, ain't nobody going to question what you're up to, because it's always Dame time when you're on the court. So that's always the factor. And then guys that do nothing at all away from basketball or away from football and are terrible, maybe they should do more. Maybe they should take up Parcheesi. I don't know. Maybe diversifying your time would help you. Maybe Will Hernandez would benefit from taking up some outside football activities to help distract his mind a little bit.
Exactly. And you know what? Listen, I'm not going to labor the point on Kadarius Toney. He is a 6 foot, 193 pound. They call it like a human joystick. They refer to him as like a Percy Harvin, a guy that can do it all. He is an athlete. He played quarterback in high school, broke a ton of different records, had offers from all the big SEC schools. He was ranked the 20th best athlete coming out of high school, decided to go to Florida. They've used him all over the field in a variety of ways. And when you watch his tape, it's just explosive. He's the type of guy, it doesn't matter whether he's in the slot or he's in the backfield or you're putting him in motion. Like, he needs to have 5 to 7 designed plays a game where they try to get the ball to him in space to see what's going to happen, because he is that explosive of an athlete.
No, completely different and unique than anything that the Giants have had at the receiving position, arguably since Odell Beckham Jr., right? A guy that you put the ball into his hands and it's just electric. A lot of people have talked about even the idea of, you went from Victor Cruz, you drafted Sterling Shepard, right? And then you moved away from Victor Cruz. Now you have Sterling Shepard and you drafted Kadarius Toney. Now you will probably, after this season, move away from Sterling Shepard, right? So continuing to roll over that slot position on the roster. But this player, who, by the way, I said slot, but you can put him on the outside. You can put him in the backfield. You can put him, you're going to be able to move him around the field and use him in a lot of different ways. And that's what I think makes it exciting for the Giants in general, and then for Daniel Jones as well, because unique skill set that you're adding to a dynamic receiving room now.
Yeah, the one interesting note is that Kadarius Toney is one of the older players. He's 22 years old right now, which is significantly older than some of the other players that are in the draft, like our second round pick. but overall, I liked it. I mean, how could you be upset when the Giants add a playmaking weapon to the offense that was lacking last year to begin with? You got to be excited that they're giving Daniel Jones more weapons. And honestly, if the offensive line plays the way that Joe Judge and Dave Gettleman think it's going to, Kadarius Toney is that type of piece that could make this offense, roll through the NFC East.
Yeah, and especially if you think about the running game working the way it did last year, plug in Saquon Barkley instead of Wayne Gallman, that already feels like a strength there. Now you start to get really dynamic. Now you start to get the guy in space, whether it is Toney, any of these wide receivers, including Evan Ingram at this point, get them in space, get the ball into their hands. And now it just comes down to, again, pass protection, give Daniel Jones that little bit of time to find those routes. And I think, again, I don't want to paint a positive picture in an area where I thought the Giants really needed to attack in the draft. But if they're confident in how this offensive line has been constructed, then I'm really excited to see what this team looks like week one. You mentioned a young player, something that I got away from me. When we were talking about the draft overall, we mentioned players like Joe Tryon, who ended up going to the Buccaneers, and he's just 20 years old, right? Young players that you feel really good about getting because you can continue to develop and evolve them. Azeez Ojulari, who we traded down from 42 and got extra picks and still landed what most people regarded as a first-round talent in this draft, also just 20 years old. Has some of the injury concerns, for himself, and you wonder how difficult it was to make that selection there. I always do find it fascinating when it says, well, I couldn't have taken him at 28, but if you take him at 50, what an incredible value. If the injuries are concerns, then they are concerns. But all things being equal, that he is healthy and ready to play for the New York Football Giants. How did you feel about that selection in the second round?
Yeah, I mean, his knee got checked out. Azeez Ojulari was a guy that was one of the names I was batted about at the 11th pick. It was a name that came up. Is it Kwity Paye? Is it Jalen Phillips? Who is the best edge rusher in this draft? There are projectors that Pro Football Focus says the best pass rushing grade of any edge rusher went to Azeez Ojulari. Like, he is one of the top pass rushers that was available in this draft. He had a knee injury in high school. They were worried about it being an arthritic knee. I think it was James Andrews that actually checked him out and said, nope, good to go. Knee's perfectly fine. It's healed great. And so, that was a guy that the Giants liked, but they really liked the idea of getting assets and accumulating value and making the value match up with the pick. And that felt really consistent in this draft. The Giants kept saying, we're not going to just put a square peg in a round hole and pick a guy 20 picks early just because we like him. We really need the value to match where we're selecting. And that's why the Giants did a masterful job in the first two rounds accumulating assets and getting Azeez Ojulari with the 50th pick. It's a sexy pick for steal of the draft, or best value pick. You see, Mel Kiper and those guys are basically saying the steal of the draft is Azeez Ojulari 50. How could you not be excited at him?
Yeah, and I think, again, so it's like tying back into, right, offensive line players. I think if Azeez Ojulari isn't there, if they, they want to trade down and get those picks, they were comfortable enough to trade down from 42 and say, let's see where the board is. If Ojulari isn't there, I would have been interested to see where would the Giants have gone. By the way, I think that as we'll move into the round 3 here and beyond, where the Giants go to a position that we maybe didn't necessarily have high on the board. But if you remember, when we talked about it following the first round, setting up day 2, I said, boy, I wonder if cornerback might be on their radar here. And I thought maybe in the second round with another possible trade down opportunity. It ends up coming in the third round at 71. They trade up, just half dancing around this draft board, friends, moving up 5 picks from 76 to get their target. And by the way, they utilized that 5th round pick that they got in the trade down with Chicago to move up. So you get yourself the extra asset to then be able to go and attack a player that you feel you really want to get. And that's Aaron Robinson, the cornerback. Obviously surprised, I think, is, there's no other way to put it. Surprised that was the selection in the third round. Again, at that point, I was still thinking offensive line might be an option for them. But where did you take that pick? How do you think it fits in? Because when you look at this roster, we know what they did in the offseason, and then let alone a lot of returning players, a very crowded room now at the cornerback position.
I love the maneuvering that the Giants did. It wasn't that we just traded all of our picks back. It wasn't that we moved all of our assets. We did a little bit of everything, which shows the Giants were getting creative. We planned for the future by getting a ton of assets for next year. But then that 5th round pick that you mentioned from the Bears, we used it to move up 5 spots to get the guy that we wanted. They used that asset brilliantly. Like, I thought that was such a great move. They said that they had Aaron Robinson in the discussion at 42. He was one of the 5 guys they were deciding between at 42. That's how high they had him ranked on the board. Most people said that he was going to be a mid-second round, early to mid-second round pick, and he slips. Yep. He keeps falling down the board, and the Giants just said there's too much value here for us to pass up. I love the pick just because I wouldn't have liked Surtain at in the first round at 11 because I would just feel like the value doesn't match the need, that type of thing that we were talking about before. This is a great pick. Everyone is saying that he's going to be able to come in and compete with Darnay Holmes for a starting spot in week 1. And that's just going to make both players better. And it's going to make our nickel packages and slot corner that much better. So for me, I'm excited about it. We definitely just got better at the cornerback position. It may also be telling that maybe there's a cornerback on our roster that maybe they aren't thinking too much about.
Well, and it's funny, right? I mean, the first guy that comes to mind, or at least because, for me anyway, is Darnay Holmes. Just got drafted, 4th round selection. We thought maybe he flashed a little bit, but we know it was a hodgepodge and just kind of make our way through the season last year at the position. And a 4th round pick isn't somebody that automatically needs to be a starter for you, let alone as a rookie. So I think Darnay Holmes now gets bumped probably down into that depth role potentially if this young player can go ahead and come into camp and take a starting job. Of course, one Samuel Beal, who made that choice to opt out of the opt out of the season last year. We know we spent a conditional 3rd round pick on him. He didn't really pan out. Now you're what? I mean, technically we're entering year 4, but it's really year 3. And what it really is it's probably, the last the last stand for him. So I think, this is the other piece because we know we're going to touch on the other picks as well, but they do go into the cornerback room again here in the draft. And I think this is the one position that the Giants, that Dave Gettleman, they are, firing bullets. They're taking their shots, right? We know what they did to try to go get DeAndre Baker, and that didn't work out. Compensatory pick on Beal, that doesn't work out. You trade for Yadam, that's a nice Band-Aid, but probably not the long-term solution. So this seems like the position. Go out and sign a premier player at the position in the offseason. This has been the thorn in Dave Gettleman's side, and I think he's going to keep trying to get that value. And to your point, a guy like this Falls that you had graded in the 2nd round talent area, that means that maybe we've gotten now, you can make the argument, we got 2 1st round talents in this draft and a 2nd round talent out of our first 3 rounds.
While also accumulating draft picks for the future. Like, you can't, how do you even put all that together? It doesn't compute to me. So whether or not you necessarily like the players, the fact that we got the value, where we did on these players plus accumulating assets, the first 3 rounds were an absolute home run. And to be honest with you, Adam, our 4th round pick, I didn't know very much about, candidly, before the selection. But why don't you talk a little bit about Ellerson Smith?
Yeah, honestly, I mean, to say that he flashed across the boards, when I'm scrolling through and doing the pre-draft stuff, yes, I saw the name, but it wasn't one that I stopped on, and it wasn't one that I did a ton of research on, and yet what we end up getting is a 6'6", or maybe even a little bit taller, 6'6.5" by some measurements, 262 pounds coming into the league. And he's a guy that has all the natural athleticism and agility that you want in an edge rusher. So it's the length. I think, I think of him like one of those athletic, natural athletes. Think of and I don't mean a comparison in terms of the player and the quality or what expect of him, but a JPP who comes in with natural athleticism and all of the measurables that you want out of the position. And all you really need is development. Has to get a little bit stronger, has to work on some of his techniques. But I think, this is a guy. There's a world that we're 3-4 weeks into the season and you're seeing Ojulari and you're seeing Ellerson Griffin, and that is the edge rushing group on the field for the New York Football Giants. There's a chance here that the Giants have stolen a starter in the 4th round of the draft.
Yeah, so you talk about the athleticism, Adam. He had a 42-inch vertical jump, which puts him in the 99th percentile in terms of athleticism. His broad jump put him in the 94th percentile. The guy is a crazy athlete. His broad jump was 7th best of anyone in the draft. So when you think about that, like he's 6'6", like 250 pounds, and he's still doing that with his athleticism. It's incredible. And a lot of people said that he was a standout in some of the different Senior Bowl drill stuff that everybody was doing. Guy had 14 sacks in 2019, so he can really get after the quarterback. He is a developmental project. Jordan Renan, I think, was the one that said he could be a better Kyler Fackrell. Is one of the comparisons that he said. But you got to be excited. The Giants obviously knew that they needed edge rushing. They got Ojulari, who was one of their main targets to begin with. And then you take a developmental one that has a chance to be great in Ellerson Smith. So for me, really happy about that pick. I'm excited to see how he comes through in camp. I'm sure that once they get him out there for, rookie days and things like that, he's going to be maybe the guy that stands out more than anyone else because of that athleticism.
Yeah, flashing, right? We're going to see that in training. You're going to hear about him in training camp because of the natural athleticism. And hopefully you're not going to hear about it. And he just sweeps around Andrew Thomas and would have gotten to Daniel Jones in a hurry on that one.
And he turned Matt Pert into a turnstile yet again. It's like, no, we don't need that. Like, that would be bad.
So as we wrap ourselves up here, the Giants did take in the 201. They took Rodarius Williams. And yes, I jumped past 196. And that's because this is my highlight special. I've talked about different running backs. Listen, I like me a running back. And if you're going to take a guy, there's a couple of reasons why I love Gary Brightwell. I think this was a nice, out of Arizona, 5'11", almost 220. So right off the bat, why I'm going to love him. It's because this dude is the battering ram. Like he's a bully running back, short yardage running back. We don't have as a compliment to Saquon Barkley and even Booker. And the thing that I don't want Saquon Barkley to have to do with consistency is really put his head down and get into the scrum sometimes. I want to have that guy that I run into the field to say, yeah, go get me those little short yardage plays for ourselves. He doesn't have tremendous speed and he doesn't need tremendous speed. Arm tackling is not going to be something that brings him down. He's going to fight through those very easily. And then most importantly, I think to me, is that when you go back and look at his collegiate career, guy doesn't have a lot of tread on the tires. This is a guy who only had 89 carries this past season. In his sophomore year, only had under 100. So I like getting a fresh body. And I think so often when we talk about drafts and sometimes guys that excite us, like I was excited by Kenneth Gainwell or excited by a Jaret Patterson. Well, guess what? Jaret Patterson was exciting and they were running the heck out of him at the college level. And it doesn't mean that it won't be a good pro, but in terms of longevity and getting value out of the player, this is a guy that looks like he's going to fit our specific need. And I would assume he has every opportunity to plug himself in as the third running back on the depth chart and going into the season with a very specific role carved out for himself as long as he shows everything we want through training camp.
Yeah, and the only other footnote I'll add, because you wrap that up masterfully, is that he played all different aspects of special teams in college as well. And I don't know if you know Adam, but Joe Judge used to be a special teams coach. So, maybe we'll draw some correlations that not only can he potentially be that third running back in the room with Booker and Barkley, he also provides additional value across the entire team in a whole different unit outside of the running back room.
Yes, no, 100%. And that's what we've seen this now the last couple of years from the Giants. Guys in the late round picks, show me versatility, show me that you can do different things for this team. It's why captains at college were finding their way onto the Giants roster, especially last year with guys like Cam Brown and Carter Coughlin. We will, of course, be back in. This is going to be, now it ramps up in a different way. Now we'll get into these players even a little bit more. On Wednesday, we'll take a look at the roster here and say, 53, that's all we get. We only get 53 spots here. Who are the guys? We did this going back a handful of weeks around where is this roster going to be and who are the guys on the bubble. There's a couple of names that we mentioned back then that I think are maybe even falling off the bubble, as in the wrong direction. We can maybe already earmark some of them to not be a part of this team. And that's the difficult part. Guys that we're excited about and want to see do well 2 years ago, the chance comes and goes just like that. It is the NFL. It happens in a hurry. But at the end of the day, friends, this was an exhausting weekend to try to want to be a part of this and track it and be excited about it. I'm glad that we got through it. And I am incredibly excited about what the Giants put together out of this weekend.
If I can leave Giant fans, OGP fans feeling good after this podcast, we said we gave him an A for their draft. They traded back. If you don't know about Kadarius Toney, get to learn who he is. He's a crazy athlete. And if you want to feel good about yourself about that pick, you kind of looked around and said, who? Why did they do that? Urban Meyer is the head coach of the Jacksonville Jaguars. He had the 25th pick. He said there was one pick in the draft that literally broke his heart. And that was the Giants selecting Kadarius Toney, because he said the guy is a human highlight film and they were going to pick him with the 25th pick. So feel good, Giant fans. We may have gotten Devonta Smith taken away from us at 11, but we took Kadarius Toney away from the Jacksonville Jaguars at 25.
Didn't need him. Don't want him. Hope the Eagles fall flat on their faces. Anyway, you can follow us, of course, at One Giant Podcast on social media. You can follow the podcast itself, download it, rate, review it, leave those 5-star reviews if you're so inclined. We really appreciate it. We will be back in, as we say, on Wednesday, breaking down the roster, looking ahead to training camp. This is when it gets even juicier. Just when you thought it couldn't get any better. Now we're talking about young rookie class and what it means for this team and what the expectations we're going to set for a, naturally, 17-game season. Until next time, friends, as Andy Makowitz would want, need, and demand that you know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.